When civil unrest stops being civil, when the rights of the people are infringed upon enough that they take matters into their own hands, when violence is not just possible, when it becomes inevitable, that is when an uprising begins. Hello everybody, my name is Kyle Ott and welcome to Desks and Dorks. We bring you historically themed tabletop role-playing game content before we begin. All of the YouTube pleasantries really do help us out immensely. However, the best ways to help us out are to get yourself games from us. You can get digital copies for our role-playing games by following the QR code there or the link in the description to itch.io. You can also get physical copies over at Tabletop Bookshelf, Indie Press Revolution, Exalted Funeral, and if you would like to have your name in the credits to get early access to our content and to get a free role-playing game every month that you cannot get anywhere else, the best way to do that is over on Patreon. Now, with that out of the way, my friends, we are going to talk all about populist uprisings, peasant revolts, and how you could successfully win a revolution, a couple of things. We're going to cover the ways that peasants, the lower class, rose and fought against the powers that be, how those ways failed and were confronted, and how to make those concepts work in a fantasy role-playing game. Now, a couple important caveats. One, I'm treating this like a challenge mode. There is no equalization here. This is a true medieval revolution. We are going to pretend that we are the leaders of a peasant army, and we have to somehow make lasting change stick through violent methods. That means no firearms, no magical equivalents, nothing to help us equalize the playing field. And again, I am leaning very hard into the idea that this is a challenge. In doing so, we are going to discuss actual uprisings, how you can do it, our strengths and weaknesses, and eventually how to tie those into our games. One last caveat, or two last caveats, I should say. I was trained as a Eurocentric medievalist. That means that I am going to look at medieval Europe specifically for this video. However, populist uprisings are not a isolated or strictly European occurrence. Those other time periods, those other parts of the world are worth engaging with. They are worth learning about. I leave them out here, not because they are not important, but because I do not have the nuance and training to present them with the respect that they deserve. Finally, violent revolution comes with a lot, and I mean a lot, of collateral damage. If you are planning on running this as a part of your campaign, I would highly encourage you to lean into some safety tools. Make sure your players are feeling okay. Make sure everybody is on board with the content that you're bringing to them before you start play. I think that's essential. But with that out of the way, let's talk revolution. Now, the first thing we need to do, if we're going to lead a peasant uprising, a peasant revolt against the upper class, we have to understand our limitations and our strengths. This, I think, is essential. It's step one to allowing us to conquer the powers that be. And there are quite a lot of strengths when we are comparing the heavily armed upper class to us, to the peasantry, to the common folk, the small folk, if you will. And it starts with training. You see, I think it's really easy for us as fans of popular culture and medieval media to neglect the fact that a knight isn't just sort of somebody who was anointed once. There were nobles who did hold that position, but for the most part, a knight, quote unquote, is somebody who's been training from a very, very, very young age, usually as early as 7 or 8. However, in some cases, we have evidence of knights being trained a little bit earlier, somewhere around the age of 6. Now, not only did they have a long time of training, not only was this their sole dedication, because obviously they weren't going to be working in a field, but this training was vast and widespread. It included things like boxing, wrestling, swimming, and a number of different skills, including horseback riding and tracking, that all make a single knight a huge problem. Again, we lack the formal training. We're busy out in the field doing work, or at best, doing a craft of some kind that is going to help us gain money. However, those crafts and that solidarity that you find working in a field with so many of your kin, that's going to come into play and help us out a little bit later. But it's important for us to understand that training is a strength of the enemy and a weakness of the peasantry. Let's also talk about equipment, because this is probably our biggest weakness, pound for pound. Yes, a singular knight might be skilled, but without their armor, they're going to have far greater issues against even a single unarmed peasant. One lucky blow, and we're probably going to be okay. However, a knight, when kitted out in a full suit of mail or plate, whatever you want to call it, I'm going to call it plate mail because that's how most RPG fans know it, but coated out in a full suit of plate mail is going to be totally and completely effective at negating many different weapons that we have access to. Now, this would not be as problematic if the knight was also not kitted out with some of the greatest weapons in the medieval world. The sword is basically a one-stop shop catch-all weapon that allows the knight to be effective at pretty much every situation. There are even, obviously, multiple swords that you could wear, and some knights did wear 2 swords, one for close range and one for a little bit longer range, which means that even if we manage to get the knight up close and personal, he's still going to be able to take us out in pretty difficult fashion, pretty brutal fashion, but it goes beyond the sword as well. Knights have access to things like warhammers, to maces, things that can crush pretty easily. And let's be real for a second, if you're trying to flail around looking for a gap in plate mail or hoping to pin the knight down where you can jam the knife up underneath the helmet where the soft fleshy parts are, and the knight is swinging around a mace, let's be real for a second, even a glancing blow from a mace is probably going to break an arm or shatter bone. This means that not only is the knight able to shrug off the majority of our attacks, but even a single, not even full hit from the knight is going to send plenty of peasants straight to the medieval morgue. We also have left out the battle axe, which is gruesomely effective at anti-infantry combat and would have been used by knights who were experienced in on-foot fighting. Again, equipment makes a massive difference when we are looking at the disparity between our troops and between the enemies. It also comes down to experience. Now, you might think this is the same as training, but anybody who's actually trained for a situation and then experienced a situation can tell you that there is no actual substitute for going in and experiencing something the right way or the wrong way for yourself. I can say this is true for everything from things like game design and game publishing. Oh boy, did I think this was going to be totally different as opposed to when I actually started running this company on my own. And to things like actual combat. Any of you who have been in a real fight or even a staged fight for combat sports, like I have done several times, can tell that that is totally different than sparring practice or than your just run-of-the-mill roll on the mats with your teammates. It is totally and completely different. There is a level of psychological impact that those activities have that the peasantry is not going to be used to, but that a hardened knight or a veteran soldier in service of ruling powers has. There is an edge to the experience that basically enhances and heightens what they get from their training and from their equipment. Again, taking down even a single powerful knight is going to be a very, very difficult proposition for the medieval serf. However, the greatest strength of the medieval knight is not their experience, not their training, not their weapons, not the wealth of military knowledge and tactical nuance that they possess. No, it is in the very wealth that the medieval peasant generates. You see, wealth, abilities in economics, those are the biggest strength of the enemy. Even if the peasant were to achieve momentary gains, it does not take much for the nobility to regroup and use their vast sum of resources to come back stronger, angrier, and with a better plan right afterwards. In fact, this means that the longer a revolution goes on, the less likely it is to achieve lasting gains, especially during the Middle Ages and the medieval era, because again, we don't have stuff like gunpowder or magic to be an equalizer here, so wealth is going to play a massive role, and deep coffers matter very, very much. However, not all is lost for the peasantry. No, in fact, there are several strengths that we possess that could allow us to achieve victory when applied correctly, and the first one is our numbers. Now here's the thing, there are a lot, and I mean a lot more peasants than there are knights, and while an individual knight may be able to kill 3 peasants during a fight, the other 16 are more than able to tackle them to the ground, rip their armor off them piece by piece, and then end them with the business end of a dagger. Here's the thing, this was, by the way, not just a piece of conjecture or a little bit of narrative flavor text for you, this was a very real tactic that was included in historical fighting manuals. Literally, one of the best strategies for the medieval infantrymen, especially the poorly trained one, was to just swamp the living daylights out of a knight, tackle them to the ground, and then stick them with the pointy end until there's more, hemoglobin seeping out of the knight's armor than there is chivalry. I'm just going to say right now, however, that in addition to there being more peasants than there are knights, it also takes far longer to train a single knight than it does to train a single peasant uprising member, and that is going to play a very pivotal role for us in battle. And that also ties into time. You see, here's the thing. Making armor, making weapons, and the degree of training necessary to create a wonderful fantasy unaliving machine like a chivalric knight means that there is so much downtime in between a time when a knight becomes recruited as a squire and the time that they actually get into the battlefield proper. Now, again, they did arm squires, and squires did manage to find their way onto medieval battlefields. In some cases, that's how they managed to get knighted in the first place and rise above the station of squire. But again, a full-fledged knight takes a long time to train, a long time to equip, and they're incredibly costly and time-consuming to get those skills. Again, we don't have to be perfect, we just have to put forth a decent enough combatant in a short enough amount of time for it to matter, and for those numbers that we talked about earlier to play a pivotal role in destroying our enemies. And again, this does matter. You can make anybody a knight, as the wonderful movie Kingdom of Heaven would attest to. However, that does not impart necessarily the skills, nuance, and mettle necessary for them to be successful on the battlefield. But perhaps our greatest strength, more than anything else, is anonymity. The knight does not care about us. The nobility, in many ways in medieval England and in other places in the medieval world, did not have a really close working relationship with their serfs. This matters a lot because the higher up that you go on the chain, the less likely it is for the ruling class member to know who the heck you are or where you're from. This means that, like a certain group of merry men prancing around the woods, we can attack, take what we need, achieve our goals, and then fade into obscurity, scattering out amongst the wilderness, the hinterlands, and smaller villages where we are not going to be found, because again, they don't know us. And anonymity is probably not only going to be our greatest defense, it is also going to become our single greatest weapon. Now, to show how all of these different things matter and how they would have played into battle, we're going to talk about the Revolt of 1381. This was a massive and important conflict in English history because it essentially is the most successful peasant uprising, at least in the Middle Ages and in medieval Europe, that I could find, and it's a great case study on how to lead an effective revolution and the steps that happen to make that revolution no longer a success after you think you have achieved your goals. But before we get into the revolution proper and the Revolt of 1381, we have to talk about the Black Death. You see, the seeds for this rebellion are planted in the root of disease. The Black Death rages through Europe, and if there's one positive effect that comes out of it, which is not something I thought I would say about a plague that claimed the lives of, hundreds of millions of people across the world and decimated several different time periods, there is one. It's that the Black Plague leads to a greater sense of social mobility. You see, prior to the Black Death, most serfs simply had to work on the place or the fief that they were born, and they did that pretty much forever. However, when the Black Death depopulated many of these fiefs, the demand for workers of any kind, trained, skilled, or otherwise, skyrockets. For the first time ever, nobles are loaning out serfs to their neighbors, to other nobles, to other fiefs. And this allows for these workers to essentially lobby for and essentially get better wages, better working conditions, and additional training. Not only does this raise the wage for your average medieval serf, but serfs who had had no opportunity prior are able to step into skilled craftsman roles for the first time. This really is the democratization of skilled labor in medieval Europe, and it's only because the noble class was so desperate to get people to work their now depopulated fiefs, they had no other option than to open those opportunities up to everyone. For the first time, the economic incentive of helping the serfs improve their lot in life, both monetarily and with the skills that they attained, was suddenly aligned with the nobles' goals of survival and maintaining their status of living. This means that for the first time ever, there is a perfect confluence of opportunity, ability, and social nuance that allows the serfs to realize that there is a much greater world beyond where they live, and there is much greater goods and glory to be attained in their lifetime than they ever thought possible. Again, this is the beginning of the dream, and it's important. Again, if we're going to say one good thing about the Black Plague, it's this. The beginning of the dream happens here. It happens when the nobles have to let their serfs work on other fiefs. They have to give them those opportunities, and we're going to see what happens as a result of that. You see, after the Black Plague is done, the nobles are realizing that it's going to be very, very difficult for them to continue to support the lifestyles. The Black Plague has not only depopulated their fiefs, but it's also drained their coffers. And as a result, in the several decades after the Black Plague, the nobles seek to sort of rebuild their wealth. And in order to do this, they institute a series of really, really awful reforms that are aimed at limiting the rights of the fief and the rights of the serfs that work on those fiefs, right? So one of the things that happens is they institute a poll tax, which means that every single person gets charged a flat percentage based on just their existence there, which they hadn't really done before. They had done things similar to it, but this was the first time that it was strictly enforced, usually enforced, by the way, with heavily armed tax collectors. This is actually, I think, one of the inspirations for Robin Hood and Black Arrow as well. Another great story if you've never watched that, but the idea of the wealthy, corrupt medieval tax collector does come from this time. In addition to a poll tax, heavy penalties were imposed on serfs or individuals of low birth who traveled away from the fief that they were born on to work in other ones. However, many serfs still continued to do this illegally, and worst of all, the nobles successfully petitioned King Richard to reduce the wages of the serfs to pre-Black Plague levels. So for the first time ever, you have heavy taxation, you have a inability of social mobility, and you basically make it impossible for the serfs to make the living that they have become accustomed to and the living that they know the nobility can provide them. All of this provides fuel for the fire that is the revolt of 1381. Enter a man by the name of Wat Tyler. Wat Tyler is by all accounts, a very interesting, an intriguing figure. He is a peasant. However, most of the people that have talked about him, or the sources that describe him as having a crazy amount of eloquence. Weirdly enough, Wat Tyler is not his surname. There is some speculation on what his name actually means. Wat could just stand for wit, so it could have been like old Tyler, essentially, but we're not sure who he is or where he really came from. There's that anonymity again, rearing its wonderful head as a revolutionary tool. However, Wat Tyler basically strikes up an alliance between several different rebel groups from other sections in England, and when those tax collectors essentially come to enact the poll tax and also enact those fees and crack down on people leaving the fief, Wat Tyler says, "I've had enough," and leads an armed mob essentially to take out those tax collectors and their guards. This leads to a wave of populist violence that stretches all across medieval England, and eventually, with Wat Tyler at its head, those disparate rebel groups from across England converge on London, and they take the city. At one point, Richard is forced to flee. Many of his officials are forced to go into the Tower of London, where they are later dragged out and executed by Wat Tyler's men. Again, this is really important because he not only takes out most of the nobles that they wanted to take out, or not most, but many of the nobles they wanted to eliminate during this time, but he does get the king to verbally consent to many of the reforms and changes that those rebel groups requested. Now, here's the downfall of the rebellion happens. Once, though, the king has agreed to those, but not signed them over into law, once they've taken the Tower of London, which is pictured here, by the way. I thought you guys would enjoy a picture of the Tower of London. It's not actually one tower, which is kind of odd. I never knew that. But once he has sort of signed those into, not signed, but promised them to the serfs, once they have eliminated many of the people, the belligerents that they wanted to get rid of, the majority of the rebels go home. Wat Tyler sticks around to basically run London. He sacks London for a little bit, not really sacks, but essentially stays there looking for sympathizers to the king, other nobles that he can unalive, what have you, and continues to be there for a little bit. He strikes up one meeting with Richard. Richard says, "Yeah, man, no, homie, I love you. It's all love between you and me. Big Rich and Wat Tyler forever, baby." And presumably they made up a sick handshake and they dapped each other up at the end. And then a second meeting happens, and to quote one of my favorite memes ever, Wat Tyler is vibe checked by the mayor of London and his men. He is slashed across the back of the head. He falls off of his horse. He is taken to a poor hospital where he is later captured by Richard's men. Richard had since fled the city, come back with more soldiers and a militia that he was able to raise, essentially armed mercenaries that he was able to raise using funds that he had taken from the nobility, and was able to not only retake London, but to unalive our buddy Wat Tyler and then parade his head around London on a spike. On top of all of these things, and on top of this being a rip-roaring great story about the horrors and the trials, the tribulations, and the triumphs of a revolution, I think it ultimately is indicative of the ways that a revolution can be successful and the pitfalls that we have to avoid if we want it to work. So here are the important takeaways. After extensive reading about the Revolt of 1381, here are the lessons I think we can distill from it and things that could help you run a peasant revolt, a populist uprising, or a takeover of the realm away from the knights and kings that have held you down. Here's what you can do to make your peasant revolt successful. The first step is to coordinate. See, Wat Tyler wasn't successful because he had a zealous group of warriors. He did. He wasn't just successful because those warriors were willing to fight and die for him. They were. He was successful because he was able to coordinate with multiple groups from around the country in order to make that populist movement work. Here's the thing. They can put out one revolution, one revolt, one peasant uprising. However, the odds of them being able to put out 25 all at once are going to be very, very, very difficult and are going to spread their resources thin. Coordination is key. And again, anonymity helps here. They won't know who you are while you're coordinating, and if you do it correctly and you operate in secrecy, you can coordinate and not get caught. Arm accordingly. Remember, our peasants don't have the types of trainings, but the weapons that were used during this time were incredible. Things like spears allowed the peasants to keep knights at bay. They were also fantastic anti-cavalry weapons and great defensive weapons as well. Again, we are using the strengths. We have more of them than they do of us. And because of that, we can mass spears to prevent cavalry charges, use them to cordon off areas of a city, and of course just, unalive a knight by basically just picking them full of holes like a reverse porcupine, which, by the way, does happen. It's part of the effectiveness of a phalanx against cavalry, or a skiltrum against cavalry, which was used by the Scottish. Fun fact for you. Another thing that we can do is just use good old Mother Nature. Rocks, logs, and any heavy object hurled from great height is going to do a lot of damage, regardless of the armor that you're wearing. Again, let's make use of Newton's good old friend gravity. And a lot, and I do mean a lot, of rocks. On that topic, slings were the weapon of choice for many bandits because the rate of fire was so effective, and it was easy to train large numbers of slingers, and when you massed slingers together, you could have a very great effect, particularly against lighter armored opponents, or like a knight wearing a breastplate and a helmet as opposed to like a full suit of plate. That would have been very, very difficult to battle against. Again, slings help a lot. We're trying to lean into weapons that allow us to take advantage of our numbers and our coordination. Never engage directly. I looked at a number of populist revolutions and peasant revolts for this video, and one of the death knells of all of them is that they never really engaged them directly. Wat Tyler essentially just led a series of highly successful skirmishes and ambushes that culminated in them taking London while the majority of the city's fighting force was already away in battle. Again, never face them directly. Get them somewhere that you want them, and then be somewhere else to take advantage of their absence. This is the best way to win these kinds of revolutions. Hit them where they're weak, divide their resources, and keep them guessing where your next battle or next attack is going to come from. Ideally, you're leaning into anonymity again, and you're creating splinter cells, or just cells in general, secret cells, that allow you to operate in plain sight and then strike when the going gets tough. I love this, and I think it's the best way to do it. Again, never engage the enemy directly. A straightforward conflict is what they want, and it is going to help them win. If you're leading a peasant uprising, don't engage your opponents in open warfare. And finally, get what you want and get out. Wat Tyler overstayed his welcome, and it's entirely possible if he had just, eliminated a corrupt court official or got exactly what he wanted from the king in writing, that he may have been able to extend his life, maybe plea for amnesty, flee the country, or continue to foment rebellion and eventually create lasting or longer lasting change. Get what you want and get out. Identify the goals of the revolution clearly and quickly, make them something that is achievable swiftly, because your revolution is eventually going to peter out. People are going to want to go home to their lives, their families, their work, and the things that sustain them. They're not going to be able to stay there forever on campaign, and we cannot hope to equal the wealth of an entrenched nobility or entrenched king. We must strike quickly, determine what we want, and get it, and then get out and disperse. This is critical. Here's the thing. I said we were going to lead into anonymity. I've hinted at it. This is the big thing. If we can get in and get out, they can't destroy every single peasant. They might make examples of some people, and some innocents, unfortunately, that's the case with a revolution, might get caught in the crossfire. But the majority of a revolutionary force, it's possible that you could disperse into the countryside, have them slip into urban lives or into villages in the hinterlands, into remote places, and scatter when all of this is done. This makes it really, really difficult for your enemies to destroy your command structure or the key and critical players in the revolution after it's already happened. Again, this also means that if your revolution was successful, your opponents are going to constantly be afraid that eventually there might be another one. And yes, maybe they'll be looking over their shoulders for a while, but that's not necessarily a bad thing to keep them dividing resources and time looking for another revolution that may or may not ever come again. Get what you want, get out, and then disperse. This is the best way to use your anonymity and the fact that the nobility needs the serf to our advantage. Now you might be asking to yourselves, Kyle, how are you going to help us game masters and game players put a peasant revolt, a populist uprising into our games? Well, my dear friends, you've come to the right place, because rather than give you an enemy or variant rule set, I'm actually going to break down how I think a populist uprising, a peasant revolt of this kind would occur and take place in a fantasy city. Allow me to introduce you to the city in question. Everybody, this is Uanova. It is crumbling under the weight of a trade war brought on by an unpopular king. People are starving, craftsmen are going unpaid, and only the highest level of the nobility and knights are prospering. These corrupt individuals have occupied every layer of government, and they're not only taking money away from the people, but are making it impossible for those at the lowest rungs to help live. There is a general feeling of discontent, a general feeling of disquiet. However, there are three very big players who might be coordinating something a little bit larger. On the one hand, you have the river traders. These are individuals who bring stuff in and out of Unova's rivers, and as a result of the tariffs and taxes, are beginning to not only lose their livelihoods, but the chance that they will ever be able to make something of a life for themselves and their families. Then you have outer merchants who set up stalls and temporary markets exactly outside of Unova's walls. Because they continue to exist outside of those walls, they bring in essential goods, but because they have to exist outside those walls, they're seen as less than by the other wealthier merchants and business folk of the city. And last but certainly not least, that you have the brothel attendants. I wanted to call them the garden lilies, but I think that's kind of a cool name for it. Perhaps this brothel district is called the Garden. I thought that was kind of neat. But they are essentially purveyors of flesh, and those who work in the brothels, they have seen the worst of the abuses of this king and his court, and as a result are also privy to a lot of those secrets. They're based the closest to the king and his nobility. So here's how this would work. And again, this revolution, this populist uprising, this peasant revolt has two main goals. And the first one, by the way, this is a map of Unova. It's just a Neverwinter map, but we're gonna co-opt it for today. The first one is to seal the city. Now, this are where the three different factions are going to be based on. The river traders like to base themselves on the coast and up and down the canal that cuts through the city. The outer merchants are taking one section of the outer wall. They realize they can't take all of it, but they're going to take one to start. And the brothel attendants are going to be inside that walled off area, to the lower left-hand corner. Now, here's where it's going to start. In order to seal the city off, they coordinate a three-pronged attack. The river traders crash their boats at both ends of the canal, meaning that no one can get in or get out of the city by water. Now, they do this because A, it's going to be impossible to clear out that shipwreck in any length of time without being fought off by the boat traders themselves, and B, if nobody can get in or out, then the boat traders suddenly have a much bigger market that they are going to be able to expand on. And if you look at that walled off island at the mouth of the bay, that's going to come into play for our river traders a little bit later. The merchants on the outside, however, realizing that they do not have the manpower, although they do have quite a bit of capital to take the entirety of the walls, decide that through a series of coerced bribes of foreign mercenaries that they have purchased, and essentially just using their own disgruntled selves to purchase weapons and armor, storm part of the walls themselves and take 5 primary guard towers, essentially rendering the city unable to protect itself fully, now being unable to escape by boat, and again, not being able to get out of one of the 2 major roadways leading into the city. They have effectively cut the city in half, which is amazing for their revolution, because inevitably those outer merchants might potentially want to claim the north half of the city for themselves, which could be interesting. However, they're getting support in the south from the Garden Lilies, who, because they're the ones that are allowed in the royal district, in the noble district, in the area that the king's court tends to frequent, they can move in and out of those manors. They have begun a campaign of terror against them. Nobles are showing up poisoned or strangled, drowned, and eliminated, and no one knows why. And of course, because the nobility are so reliant on the Garden Lilies for, pleasure and for enjoyment, and because they underestimate them, their sort of attacks have gone maybe not unnoticed, but unsuspected, which is a very, very useful thing when the rest of the other, shall we say, belligerents in this revolution or this revolt are doing, shall we say, the quote-unquote, the grunt work of attacking. The Garden Lilies are sort of attacking the nerve center, the command center of the enemy faction. Now, the next goal after this is to assemble power. The river workers want to do this because they want to establish their own independent ports. This allows them to gather wealth and ensures their trade flows not just to their coffers, but to the coffers of their allies. Again, this is a huge deal. They recognize the importance that trade has played in propping the current king up, and they recognize that people are desperate for the goods and for the food that is now critically more expensive because of his administration. The other one is that the merchants are going to try to take over weapons production in the city. They realize that in order for this revolution to take hold and for this revolt to be successful, they will need far better equipment than what they have access to, and that it's far less expensive than buying it from other sources. They want to be able to make it themselves. They chose the Northern Wall because it is access to not one, but 2 of the major smiths in the city, people who can produce weapons on a massive scale, and by taking those over, they seek to aim and arm even more of the population to help them take the southern half of the city. It's why I numbered these, by the way. It's why the armory on the southern half of the city is in fact the last goal. They want to take both of them first. They already have that wall, and then by doing that, they'll be able to arm enough people to take over the city proper. And finally, the Garden Lilies just want to sow chaos. They recognize that while the administration at the top, the king and his most quote-unquote trusted is probably the wrong word for it, but trusted cronies are incompetent and unable to make critical decisions, they rely on a robust bureaucracy of middle-level nobility in order to remain effective. They know that by sowing chaos, it's going to make the decision-making of that much, much more difficult, and the longer that they can remain anonymous, the longer that they can strike and then disperse back into the shadows, the better chance the rest of the revolution in this city is going to have. Now, what happens to the river traders, the outside merchants, and the Garden Lilies is entirely up to you. Will they succeed? Will your players step in to help them? Will your players be hired at fairly exorbitant rates to squash them? Will your players even be able to stop these 3 factions, or will they find another solution? Will they perhaps be able to broker a peace? That is entirely up to you, but I do hope that you will use this as potentially the foundation for your own Peasant Revolt style of game. And with that out of the way, that brings us to the end of today's video. I sincerely hope that you have enjoyed this one, and if you like this, again, the YouTube pleasantries are great, but the best way to support us over at Desks and Dorks is, again, to get our games. This QR code will take you to our itch.io page, but you can, again, get physical copies from Tabletop Bookshelf, Indie Press Revolution, Exalted Funeral, and if you would like to get an RPG every single month, if you would like early access to our videos, and if you would like to be thanked in videos just like this one, this QR code will take you straight to the Desks and Dorks Patreon page. Now, before I leave, I want to thank all of our amazing patrons: Dionysus, Chris Bates, Agile Monk, and Ignacio Zeggers. Thank you all so much, guys, for making this possible. I really do appreciate it. Again, folks, if you are watching and you would like to get a shout out as well, in addition to early access, they got to see this video before everybody else did, and they get a game every single month, you can join the Patreon. But until next time, I am Kyle Ott for Desks and Dorks. You have all been absolutely amazing, and I'll see y'all in the next one. Peace.